Hey everyone, long time no see. I know you all have been missing me for a while, so I thought I'd make a video about something more light-hearted than we usually cover. While there are a few videos out there that claim to talk about urban legends from North Korea, none of them do. And I mean 100% of them are either South Korean or Japanese urban legends that are repackaged as North Korean urban legends for views. In reality, sourcing urban legends from the Hermit Kingdom requires far more time and effort than these channels are evidently willing to do. So, as the saying goes, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. So, without further ado, here are a collection of myths and urban legends that are 100% sourced from North Korea. When asked if there are any popular ghost stories in North Korea, the anonymous defector replies that due to North Korea's status as a socialist state, ghost stories and other forms of superstition are discouraged by party officials, and thus aren't very common among the North Korean people. He did, however, recall one ghost story he swore everyone in the South Hamgyong province knows about. According to local legend, there is a mountain in the South Hamgyong province called Chidok Mountain. This mountain is reportedly notoriously haunted by disheveled, groaning spirits who will relentlessly pursue you until you are either caught, vacate the mountain, or manage to evade capture until sunrise, whereupon the spirits will suddenly evaporate into oblivion. The urban legend is so commonly known in the area that parents have exploited the ghosts of Chidok Mountain instead of wild tigers to warn their kids about wandering off at night. According to the defector, the origin of the story owes itself to the painful history of the Korean War. It is said that during the retreat from North Korea after the Chinese intervention, a brigade of South Korean soldiers was unable to retreat and found themselves encircled on the Chidok Mountain. With no hope for relief and surrender meaning certain death, the doomed South Korean soldiers held out for as long as they could, only attempting to break out at night while lying motionless during the day to not reveal their location to the Chinese. These breakout attempts failed, however, and the South Korean soldiers eventually either died of starvation or were eventually liquidated by Chinese forces. The defector goes on to say that there is a great deal of remorse by the locals for the South Korean brigade that perished there. However, because they are Southern soldiers, the locals are not permitted to honor their departed brothers in any way, and no memorials or plaques exist detailing what occurred there. The defector concludes his story by encouraging the reunification of Korea, so that Southerners and Northerners may pay respects to the trapped souls on Chidok Mountain, allowing them to finally find peace. The following story comes from a female North Korean defector living in Seoul. Every culture has its own unique traditions when it comes to burying the deceased. In Korea, burial tombs are distinct for their large mounds, creating an unmistakable image of the final resting places of the departed. My father-in-law passed away when I was still living in North Korea. After we buried my father-in-law, my husband, who had up until that point never been seriously sick in his life, began to suffer from frequent bouts of sickness. It got to the point that he could scarcely walk. We took him to the hospital and he was diagnosed with hepatitis. However, this diagnosis made no sense, as my husband does not drink or suffer from any autoimmune disease. Soon after the mystery diagnosis, I began to fall seriously ill as well. Worse yet, at night I would experience recurring fever dreams of my deceased father-in-law coming to me. In these dreams, he would speak to me in a disembodied voice, saying that his spirit was still living inside our house and that he was cold. Unable to make sense of what he was saying, and out of fear for our health, we consulted a local shaman priest who conducted a seance. It was during the seance that the shaman informed us that my father-in-law was irate with us because he was cold and needed a proper grave. It was at this point that we discovered what a terrible mistake we had made. This was in the 1990s during the famine, when people were dying left and right of each other. Because of this, The government heavily restricted the construction of proper burial mounds for the dead, as the sheer abundance of them would have required deforestation and a waste of precious government resources. My father-in-law had to be buried in the flat earth with no decorations or even a stone marker. This caused his spirit great discomfort and was unable to rest until a proper burial was performed. We were unable to perform this request due to it being illegal and a high chance of being robbed. We ended up defecting not long after to South Korea. My husband and I soon recovered from illness and moved on with our lives. However, not without the tremendous guilt we suffer from knowing that my father-in-law is still buried in an unmarked grave in the north, cold and alone in a country the world left behind. People in South Korea and abroad tend to view the North Korean army as a bunch of vicious killers without remorse or fear. There tends to be this perception that the North Korean army frequently crosses the DMZ in raids and repeatedly starts conflicts along the DMZ. While this is certainly true to an extent, as a former soldier in the KPA, I can say with certainty that there are times when the South instigated conflict and crossed over to our side. My father was stationed on the DMZ during the 1980s and was nearly killed by South Korean commandos in retaliation for a terrorist attack. You see, in 1983, North Korea attempted to kill South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan during his visit to Burma. Now, ordinary soldiers and citizens like us had absolutely no idea that our country had tried to assassinate him, or that the event had even occurred. Nevertheless, the assassination attempt failed, and Chun Doo-hwan vowed revenge. One night, my father was standing guard on a border checkpoint close to an army village called Nosang, less than 15 kilometers from the South Korean city of Paju. At around 3 in the morning, a truck approaches the checkpoint and is ordered to stop for inspection. My father, doing his duty, asks to see the driver's papers. Little did my father know, he was just about to come within inches of losing his life. You see, Chun Doo-hwan originally planned to launch a massive military invasion against the North for the assassination attempt, and this would be preceded by commando raids in and around the areas leading to Kaesong, where elite South Korean soldiers would eliminate high-value targets and infrastructure in order to allow the invasion to proceed more quickly. My father just so happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The moment the soldier handed over the relevant documents, he immediately produced a pistol, shooting my father twice in the chest. My father instantly crumpled to the ground, unable to speak or move due to the collapsed lung caused by the bullet. All my father could do was writhe in pain as the commandos plowed their truck through the barricade. Dismounting from the truck, clad in North Korean army uniforms, they began engaging the soldiers at the barracks who were completely caught off guard by what was happening. Inevitably, one by one, members of my father's regiment were gunned down by the South Korean commandos who slipped away, presumably back across the border as quickly as they came. My father was eventually found and taken to a military hospital, where he miraculously survived all night in the cold with a collapsed left lung and a bullet that came within millimeters of piercing his heart. While recovering, my father was forced to sign an affidavit swearing that he would not speak about what happened here. In exchange for not telling people the truth about how his entire unit had been annihilated, he'd get to tell people that he'd been shot in a heroic clash along the DMZ, where they had expelled the South Korean puppets. He was allowed to leave the army only 3 years into his compulsory service, and received benefits for the rest of his life. The story allowed him to live as sort of a local hero in his home village. Eventually he married and had me. My father died in 2012, right before I was due to enter the army for my service. If what my father said is to be believed, I'm the only person he'd told about what happened that night. Not even my mother knew the truth of what happened to him. I served in the army for 4 uneventful years before I was discharged in 2016 for chronic illness. I defected a year later, and now here I am living in Seoul telling all of you my father's story. The true story of how my father was nearly killed by South Korean soldiers in retaliation for an event that he knew nothing about. Don't let the name and flashy displays of peace fool you. The DMZ is an awful place where the worst of mankind is on full display. I hope everyone reading this will pray for peace between our two nations, so our brothers and sisters will no longer be forced to kill each other ever again. North Korea prides itself on the education of its citizens, often boasting of its completely free education system and propaganda both domestic and abroad. The pinnacle of this achievement is widely considered to be the Grand People's Study House. Completed in 1982, the massive library in Pyongyang covers over 100,000 square kilometers and holds over 35 million books, as well as offering educational events and lectures, all of which are accessible to all North Korean citizens for free. In the 1990s, to encourage more North Koreans to come to the library, perhaps in hopes of getting people's minds off the arduous march, North Korean leader Kim Jong-il decided to allow certain foreign publications, which previously were only available with special permission, to become available to the public, no questions asked. Among the first publications made public were translated books of UFO sightings from the United States and around the world, as a way to promote the library. Also included were cassette tapes featuring podcast-like translated commentary on UFO sightings from the declassified Project Blue Book, which, if you don't know, was the United States Air Force's official investigation of UFOs and flying saucers, which ran from 1952 to 1969. Now, keep in mind that these offerings weren't to encourage the idea of extraterrestrial life, but to promote the library by offering a taste of what it has to offer, in hopes of encouraging citizens to explore its vast archives. However, this plan backfired spectacularly and resulted in a widespread fascination with the idea of extraterrestrial life, which up until then was, should I say, an alien concept to them. For the North Koreans, whose upbringing and daily lives are irrevocably tied to the materialist Korean nationalist flavor of socialism, the existence of extraterrestrials that transcend human capabilities greatly damaged the perception of needing a great leader to make the people strong. Some unsuspecting North Koreans even said they felt skeptical of their loyalty to the party once they saw a promotional video crafted from an American film in which aliens attack Earth, believing the alien threat was imminent. It is said that for the North Koreans, whose leader and ideology were everything, UFOs became an opportunity to imagine part of the outside world, something that transcended the materialist tenets of socialist philosophy, allowing them the realization of just how small and insignificant we all are in comparison to what may exist in our universe. Eventually, the content was pulled from the library, and it is said that those who came up with the idea of promoting alien content were incarcerated for promoting anti-revolutionary activities. The Kumgang Mountain tourist region is the premier tourist destination for North Koreans and foreigners alike who are looking to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and wish to see a more natural side of the Hermit Kingdom. However, a place where thousands of years of history have taken place is bound to have some dark secrets hidden within its glorious mountain range. From 1998 to 2008, South Koreans traveled en masse to Mount Kumgang as part of the Sunshine Policy. However eager and welcoming the North was, it was still North Korea, however, and Southern tourists were allowed no more freedom than any other foreign tourists who visit the country. Still, the influx of so many tourists led to a special administrative region being developed specifically for the park, along with building the necessary infrastructure to accommodate so many guests. Over the 10 years the park was open to Southerners, one hotel in particular earned a sinister reputation. So much so that South Korean brokers repeatedly had to apologize to the North Korean hosts who had confiscated so many religious items from South Korean travelers, particularly shamans who would claim that the entire mountain is haunted by witches and ghosts. The most infamous story from the 10 years of travel comes from a former broker in the South. In 1999, a woman named Won-hee, who worked for a South Korean itinerary company based in Sokcho that organized trips to the north, received word from her supervisor that a student and a teacher had traveled to Kumgang Mountain, and that the teacher had refused to leave the hotel, even though his reservation had long since expired. Ordinarily, this could be resolved without incident. However, since the teacher was in North Korea, the teacher could under no circumstances overstay or risk arbitrary detention. The manager explained that they eventually broke down the door, but found the teacher slumped over dead. Quickly, she arranged to travel to Mount Kumgang to investigate what happened and to make arrangements for the transfer of the body back to South Korea. Upon arriving at the Kumgang Hotel, Won-hee finds herself accompanied by the hotel staff, who mention that this is not the first time such an incident had occurred. The employees confess that they believe the string of deaths and disturbing events occur because the particular hotel room, room 201, is the closest to the sea. Korean superstition holds that the shorelines are a magnet for all kinds of ghosts and spirits. Won-hee, being ever so skeptical of the supernatural, disregards the superstitious talk from her northern sisters and proceeds to meet her manager to coordinate the repatriation of the teacher's remains. Ultimately, the task is successful, and Won-hee returns to Sokcho. However, a few weeks after the incident, Won-hee is told that she must travel back to the Kumgang Hotel for a few days for an assignment. Won-hee initially thinks nothing of it and travels to the north. Upon arrival, she completes her work for the day and retires to her reserved room, just across from room 201, to retire for the night. As she begins to fall asleep, however, she begins to hear a faint whistling sound, as though someone was quietly whistling into her ear. Quickly, she shoots up and finds the pitch-dark room void of any persons beside her own. Deciding that whatever noise she had heard was a hallucination, she lies back down and tries to go back to sleep. This is immediately interrupted by the faint sounds of a man sobbing. Unable to discern where the noise is coming from, she tries in vain to ignore the crying. However, this would persist for several more nights. After days of hearing the sobbing at night, Won-hee is finally able to properly fall asleep. However, this sleep would be ruined by a nightmare in which Won-hee drowns in the sea. She abruptly awakens, coughing violently as her body tried to expel the non-existent water from her lungs. Sitting there in the dark, eyes bloodshot as she tries to compose herself, Won-hee is again alerted to the familiar sound of a man sobbing. Only this time, she pinpoints the source of the crying to the hallway outside of her room. Quietly, she tiptoes closer and places her ear up against the door. However, as soon as she does this, the crying ceases. Confused, she removes her ear from the door, whereupon the crying resumes, much more intensely than before. Freaked out, she jumps back into bed, cowering in fear at whatever lies beyond the door to her room. However, eventually, this crying also subsists. At this point, her frustration exceeds her fear, and wanting to find the person responsible for insomnia, she numbly approaches the door. As the knob turns, the door opens, revealing the inky maw that was the empty hallway outside of her room. Seemingly satisfied that no one is there, Won-hee quickly motions to close the door, when suddenly the adjacent door begins to open. The crying sound resumes once more. Frozen, Won-hee watches in terror as the opening door reveals a disheveled specter. The hazy shape faces Won-hee, uttering the words, "It's in here," as it beckons her. Won-hee's somatic reflex takes control of her body. She lets out a horrid scream and sprints towards the hotel lobby, refusing to leave the company of the North Korean employees behind the counter for the remainder of the night. Won-hee eventually is able to return to Sokcho. She relates her experiences to her manager. He gives an affirming nod and tells her that she will not have to go back to the Kumgang Hotel, and begins to tell her the full story of what had been going on. A few months before Won-hee started working, there were two men, Song-sun and Kyung. Both men worked for the company and were sharing a room at the Kumgang Hotel. Due to North Korean laws at the time, cell phones and access to the internet were forbidden, even to Southern employees. Unable to pass the time any other way, the two resorted to drinking copious amounts of alcohol after their respective shifts. One night, after an otherwise unremarkable drinking session, Song-hun awoke and noticed Kyung covering his ears and awkwardly exiting the room. Song-hun, being himself half asleep and still under the influence of alcohol, initially dismissed it as a hallucination and promptly went back to sleep. The following morning, Songhun was made aware by the other employees that Kyung was missing. The seriousness of the situation was exacerbated by the fact that they were in North Korea, where the disappearance of a South Korean worker would be treated as potential espionage by the North Korean authorities, with wide-ranging implications for the rest of the staff. However, due to the tight leash they were on as it was, they also couldn't leave their work to look for him. Song-hun started to believe that what he saw when he woke up the night before wasn't simply a drunken dream. Maybe Kyung had gone out that night and gotten lost. To make matters worse, the North Korean authorities got involved due to the length in which Kyung went missing. With the entire park on lockdown, crawling with armed North Korean sentries, it wouldn't be long before they found what remained of Kyung's waterlogged body on the shoreline by the hotel. Though lamenting the loss of his co-worker and friend, Sang-hun couldn't escape thinking of how odd the situation was. Kyung didn't drink nearly as much as he had, and the tide was exceptionally shallow, so the whole suicide wouldn't make much sense. Nonetheless, Sang-hun regretted not doing anything to stop him the night before. Despite doing his best to not let this tragedy get to him, Song-hun would be the subject to increasingly strange events following his friend's death. One particular night, Song-hun woke up to see a man, drenched in water, drinking on the floor of his hotel room. Startled, he soon realized that it was Kyung, who simply vanished as quickly as he'd materialized. Trying once more to be positive, by dismissing the specter as a symptom of PTSD or survivor's guilt, Song-hun continued to work at the hotel as best as he could. One day, Song-hun receives a call on his radio to come to the shoreline by the hotel. Song-hun's blood, however, ran cold. He recognized the voice as Kyung's, and out of desperation, he rushes to the shoreline. Song-hun arrives only to find no one there. At this point, every following night, Song-hun was said to be visited by a soaking wet Kyung, beckoning him to come to the shoreline. Said to be emotionally drained out of guilt over the incident, it wasn't long before he too was found deceased by the shoreline. Upon hearing the conclusion of the manager's story, Won-hee, out of shock, asks what hotel room they stayed in. The manager promptly replies that it was room 201, the very room Won-hee had seen the ghost emerge from. He goes on to say that even before the incident with Song-hun and Kyung, the room had been closed due to strange occurrences. After the two men had died, and plus the incident with the teacher, the room was said to be closed permanently. Sitting still in utter disbelief, Won-hee pondered what could have happened if she hadn't stayed in the lobby that night. Was the adjacent room 201 cursed? Were the shamans right? Was the entire park overrun with evil spirits? If she had stayed another night in that hotel, would the ghosts of room 201 have taken her next?